This is our third annual State of the Economy that is sponsored by the Greater Oklahoma City Chamber. We know as members you're very interested in and look to us for information on what's going on in the regional and national economies. And I know you're all looking for some insight in the coming months, looking for opportunities, hopefully, and then also being aware and get an understanding of some of the potential challenges for our businesses. But through the hard work and strong leadership of our community and businesses, and probably most importantly, the strong partnership between the business and the communities, our regional economy continues to experience solid economic growth. 2013 brought yet another year of positive job growth to Oklahoma City. When the final numbers come in, we expect that employment will have increased by about 14,000 jobs, or 2.5% over last year. And with those numbers, the Metro will have outpaced the nation's employment growth by a full percentage point. Retail, trade, and hospitality sectors had especially strong job gains of 8%, followed by construction and professional services with growth of more than 4%. Unlike recent years, 2013 did not bring extraordinary year-over-year job growth in the energy sector that we have seen in recent years. Shifting energy production perhaps from gas to oil and improved efficiency of operations in the field seem to have impacted those numbers. So far in 2013, as part of the Chamber's Forward Oklahoma City economic development efforts, the Chamber-assisted companies have announced or added 6,300 jobs, $270 million in payroll, and nearly $500 million in capital investment. This includes new-to-market firms as well as an expansion from existing companies. It has been a strong year in our area, even considering the fiscal drag from our governments. For Oklahoma City, preliminary forecasts for 2014 indicate that our region will experience about 2% growth in employment, or about 10,000 jobs. However, anticipated job growth in 2014 will certainly be impacted by what's happening with Congress and administration and their ultimate handling of the budget and our spending plans. The nation's and region's continued economic growth is expected to be slowed, as you know, by the federal budget cuts and could weigh heavily on payroll, employment, and spending growth. The Greater Oklahoma City Chamber has a multi-year strategy of focusing its economic development efforts on key industry sectors. Those sectors include aerospace, bioscience, energy, advanced manufacturing, and logistics/distribution. And Oklahoma is well positioned to continue to expand in these sectors. The success in these sectors has been evidenced by the positive job gains and an employment rate that has been lowest in the country for 26 out of the past 32 months. I think that deserves a little recognition. It's critical that the business community remains united in its efforts to continue to ensure that the Greater Oklahoma City region continues to be a place that will attract a talented and qualified workforce. At the forefront of our efforts is the need for reforms for an educational system that prepares its students for the workplace of today and tomorrow. Today, we have a panel of economists who focus on the regional economy, as well as a well-known nationally and well-respected economist, innovator, and educator who will share his perspective of the going-ons at the national level. But first, I'd like to invite up to the stage our principal's signature sponsor event, the Advest Bank, and make a few comments. And I think Brad Krieger is here. Brad, are you going to come make a couple of comments, or are we just going to continue going with the show? There you are. Please welcome Brad Krieger.
Well, as Pete said, thank you for being here for the third State of the Economy meeting. Arvest is honored to be the signature sponsor of those 3 years. Pete's spoken about the continued growth while others have struggled. Rob and I are fortunate enough, we have a guest in town this week who is very familiar with Oklahoma City. She was with the Pentagon and was absolutely instrumental in working on the GM Tinker transaction. But but she'd never really spent much time. She'd spent time out at Tinker, but really never spent much time here in Oklahoma City. So we kind of asked her what her perceptions, and certainly those perceptions are reality. Coming from Washington, D.C., I'm not sure exactly that's the standard for positive thought, et cetera, or getting anything done. So as she comes here and she sees some of the things that we're doing, she certainly is amazed. But the things she mentioned are the resiliency of this community, whether it be from the bombing, the tornadoes, the closing of the General Motors plant, or just the economy in general. She was amazed about the momentum. You know, Pete mentioned, you know, we've had the lowest unemployment rate in 26 out of 32 months. And again, that's a testament to the momentum that the community has. And Deb certainly saw the can-do attitude, which continues and really is the benchmark of what's going on in Oklahoma City. She saw it as they worked through the GM Tinker transaction, because believe me, there was impediment after impediment after impediment, and the community just says, okay, how do we get through that? And they did. And she also mentioned, besides all this, besides everything that's going favorably, the people are nice, they're bright, and they've got a real pride in their community, and that's something that in many cases you don't see. You know, while dealing with uncertainty, whose index is probably at the highest it's been in a long time and is somewhat event-driven, this community continues to focus on opportunities that are out there and making those opportunities. After years of, say, arguably having possibly a negative brand or even no brand, ours continues to build. Not only are we known here now in the United States, but if you have a chance to go to Europe or travel, et cetera, whether it be on a boat or a plane, et cetera, they know of Oklahoma City. Certainly the Thunder has helped in that regard. Anyway, if you look around this room, it's the people in this room and the people that they end up talking to that continues to take the message to make sure that Oklahoma City and the community continues its positive outlook up and to the right. Again, Arvest wants to thank you for your help and support, and I want to wish you a happy Thanksgiving this next week. So, thank you.
Thank you, Brad. Thank you, Arvest Bank, for being our signature sponsor today. So let's move on to our panel of economists that I talked about. We're going to introduce those, and perhaps you can start walking up to the stage as I introduce you, and we're going to have a brief Q&A, so get ready. Moderating our panel today is our very own Rhonda Hooper, who is the President and CEO of Jordan Associates and is the Vice Chair of Economic Development for the Greater Oklahoma City Chamber. Our first panelist is the Director of Center for Economic and Management Research at the University of Oklahoma. Please welcome Dr. Robert Duffenbach. Robert? Also joining us is the Executive Director of the Stephen C. Agee Economic Research and Policy Institute at Oklahoma City University. Please welcome Dr. Russell Evans. Russell. And our next panelist is the Regents Professor of Economics and Director for the Center of Applied Economic Research at Oklahoma State University. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Dan Rickman. Dan? Rhonda, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Pete. Appreciate that. Come on, Dan. He's from OSU. So am I. We save a wonderful person for last. Please be seated. Okay, we want to make this a lively event for the next few minutes, and we have a handful of questions we're going to pose our distinguished panelists. And then I'm going to turn it over for a few minutes for questions from the audience. So please be thinking of some interesting questions, but there are no stupid questions. I guarantee these professionals will not bite. Okay? All right. So, let's start with the first thing. I think in terms of the overall economy, as Pete was saying, there's some major, wonderful aspects going on in Oklahoma, and specifically in the greater Oklahoma City region. We should be very proud of that. But if you were to populate a SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, what would you identify are potentially some weak spots in our economy that could potentially slow down our future growth? And Russell, how about you addressing that first, but please, anybody, y'all feel free to chime in.
Sure. Thank you. So first, I got to say that the bar's been set pretty high to put three economists on a stage and ask for a lively event. I'm not sure that we can deliver on that, so but we'll do our best. I think when I look at the Oklahoma City and the Oklahoma state economy, 2013 reminds me a little bit of 2010. In 2010, we were really coming out of our recessionary experience. We had a very modest economic year, and a lot of people didn't perceive that we were having this modest growth because their history of the 2 years recession previous sort of obscured their perspectives. Similarly, we've gone through two really strong years in 11 and 12, almost a level effect jump when you look at the earnings in the state and the earnings in the city. And as we move into 2013, it's really going to prove to be a fairly modest year. And I think a lot of people, when I talk to the audiences, a lot of the audiences that I talk to don't perceive just how modest the year is going to be. But we're looking to squeeze out about 1%, probably under 1% growth statewide. As Pete mentioned, a lot of that strength is coming right here in Oklahoma City. It's really leading what strength we're seeing around the state. If I could zoom out a little bit, I'd like to talk long term and let my colleagues talk about what they're seeing in the local economy. But when I look at the strengths, I think economic geography may be our strongest point right now. What we see going on nationally is a concentration of economic activity in large metropolitan, commingled metropolitan areas that commonly referred to as megalopolis regions. And what we see going on right now is that this I-35 corridor that runs up through Texas and grabs Oklahoma City and on up into Kansas City is the third fastest growing center in the United States in terms of population. It's the fastest growing center in the United States in terms of jobs. And this resonates with what we see in Oklahoma City. When the chamber sends out your email blast and has the Forbes list of best cities or aspirational cities, and you look down that list, the list is always Dallas, Austin, Houston, Oklahoma City. It's always these cities up and down the I-35 corridor. I think winds of economic geography are blowing activity south and west and concentrating in these rich urban amenity complexes. So our strengths are really economic geography. Our strengths, particularly in Oklahoma City, is that we've done a lot in the last 15 or 20 years to build a rich urban amenity complex around which development can occur. I think our weaknesses, as I look forward, may be continuation around that amenity complex. How do we sort of the low-hanging fruit is always the easiest to observe. What's the first things you do to develop your urban amenity complex? But now that we've gone through those easiest things to identify, it's going to be harder and harder to identify what's the optimal public-private partnership, what's the next project. Other weaknesses that come to mind is how do we train a labor force, the education that again, Pete mentioned in opening comments. How do we train a labor force? How do we achieve our education objectives so that today's citizens benefit from these economic changes? How do we make it so that the residents that are here today are in a position to succeed as economic activity is blown this way? So again, strengths far outweigh the weaknesses, especially over the long term. I think Oklahoma City is well poised, but that doesn't change. There are challenges today. Dan, Bob?
Nice job, I think. Nice job. I think that you've hit many of the aspects in this region of the country. This heartland region is showing a lot of vibrancy in comparison to the nation. Just a little nuance to add here, and I'm somewhat disturbed by economic statistics that are indicating that the balance of the state, that is the state outside the major metro areas, has really stopped growing. And in fact, the latest numbers, which are only August, which allow me to divide the data that we get out of the Department of Labor, in order to assess what's going on outside of the two major metros, we had a year-over-year job decline of 8,000, and that was about 1.4%. So that was not a good sign. But Oklahoma City is really taking over the job growth scene, and it's just very clear that we've got a huge amount of momentum here.
I agree. There's not really anything I could disagree with what you guys say. I think the energy sector, I think, will continue to play a very strong role in the future here. I think our seeking energy independence nationally is going to continue to benefit all the energy headquarters that we have, and I think we're going to talk about some of these things in more detail, but I think there's still some real legs underneath this for 20 years plus, as far as I can see right now. So I think that's going to be a real strength.
Dan, while you have the mic, if you don't mind addressing, Oklahoma City has our current unemployment rate is 4.7%. And in terms of, it's one of the lowest unemployment rates among large metros, and as was said earlier, 26 out of the last 32 months. That's amazing. Will this trend continue in your opinion? And what could be done to expand our qualified workforce so that we are addressing the future needs of our businesses?
Yes, the low unemployment is quite remarkable, especially if you consider that year over year we've had over 2% labor force growth. So if you can combine strong labor force growth and low unemployment, that is really signals of strength. And partly we benefited from weakness in other parts of the country. Maybe over half of that labor force growth have been people moving from other parts of the state or other parts of the country. Now, what will be a challenge is as the country starts reaching full employment, which may take a few years yet, but we expect, at least in the 2015 to 2018 region, that U.S. will start getting towards full employment. That's going to limit some of the mobility of people. They're going to be happy where they're at, and you're going to get less labor force growth here. I think that our unemployment rate will only go down further then. I mean, from 4.7, I see it easily going down to 4. It could easily go down to 3.5%, I think, before it might get stopped. So at least short term, plenty of labor force growth, but as we reach full employment nationally, it's going to limit us. And there's a longer term issue is that nationally and in Oklahoma, there is the aging of the labor force. And if you look at the long run projections out to 2020 and beyond, they're slowing GDP growth from potential GDP growth around 3% down to the low 2s. And a real strong part of that, a primary part of that, is the slowing growth of the labor force with the aging of the labor force. So that's going to pose a challenge as the U.S. gets to full employment and we have an aging labor force. And I think maybe the final challenge, I'd like to say this will spill over in our education discussion, is that we are low in terms of our share of college graduates. If you look, and this has been very important, in 1970, the Brookings Institution just released a report that said about 25% of the college-educated populace lived in the top 20 educated cities. Now the top 20 educated cities has about 44% of college graduates. Oklahoma City is below the metro average, it's about 26%, and the growth in college graduates from 1980 to 2010 has been slower. So this is going to be a challenge for Oklahoma City, is not only in terms of overall labor force growth, but primarily getting the college graduates to be here. And research has suggested that certainly universities play a role. Many of the cities that have very large shares of their labor force that are college graduates have prominent universities. And this can include Columbus, Ohio. Maybe the top educated city was Boulder, Colorado. Research Triangle is very high. But even if you look at other cities like Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Richmond, Virginia, that are maybe more our size, they're still over 30% which college graduates relative to us. So that would be one area that I would think we need to pay particular attention to.
Bob?
No, I think I really don't have anything to add to that.
Microphone.
Don't really have anything to add to that right at the moment, but I think we do. I'm going to be talking later about the education problems that I think are very severe for us here.
Then let's segue into a point that you just made, and that's relative to education. And Bob, I'd like to address this question to you. There are currently 45,000 students in the Oklahoma City public school system, of which nearly half of those students are of Hispanic descent. With that being a case, do you think that the metro area schools, what do they need to do to adapt to this growing demographic? Otherwise, what consequences could you see occur in our workforce over the next 15 to 20 years? And what could we do proactively right now to address that?
I had this question ahead of time, which was an advantage because I could look up some data on it, because I was very much of the opinion, evidently formed some time ago when I looked at some census statistics, that educational attainment was quite low among Hispanics. And so this gave me an opportunity to look at some recent numbers, and what I found out is this is very much a waning problem. Now, when you have half your student body of Hispanic descent, Hispanic origin, then maybe you've got some special things that you ought to be doing, and talk about that. But the fact of the matter is, dropout rates among 16 to 24-year-olds, non-high school graduates among 16 to 24-year-olds, a number that stood at 40% in 1970 is down to just 13, 14% today. And furthermore, we've got some Oklahoma numbers we can look at, and in those numbers we're looking at non-graduation rates, say out of a freshman class in 2006, 2007, of on the order of 5.8%. For non-Hispanic whites, it was on the order of 3.5%. So, not quite half that. And so there's still kind of a problem there and still something to be dealt with. But certainly among the ratio for blacks was about in between at 4.5%. So I'm not trying to say that the problems of the dropping out are not with us. They are, and we certainly need to attend to such matters and reduce those rates further. But I think the problems with education in Oklahoma go much deeper than that. Data points paint a very clear picture that we are not doing enough in this state to fund education at the K through 12 level. And this is especially true in relation to teacher pay. Consider some of these facts. Now, we're looking at a very huge enterprise. We have almost 670,000 students in K through 12. We've got 522 school districts, which needs to be a lower number. We're growing. We're adding about 1% to our enrollment base, and we produce nearly 38,000 high school graduates a year, 27th in the nation. But our average salaries for public school teachers are 49th in the nation at $44,400, including fringes. 80% of the national average. And we're only 49th in expenditures as well relative to the student population, the fall population. We can do better in this state. We have a per capita income that now ranks 35th in the nation, 89.3% of the national average, not the 80% that we're paying our teachers. Percentage change in per capita personal income from 2000 to 2010 was 8th in the nation, a 44% gain. Percentage change in per capita personal income in recent years is running at a level 6th or 7th in the nation at 4.3%. We have the wherewithal to do this. Per capita revenue, state and local government, you look at these numbers, we're 45th in the nation. And per capita property tax revenue of local governments, 47th. And state and local property tax revenue per $1,000 in personal income, dead last at 50th. The property tax is a very untapped resource for getting more funds into schools. Now, you simply cannot hope to be a first-class metro area without first-class K through 12 education. And that requires paying your teachers to attract the best and get them to make careers and stay here. I've been a college professor for over 40 years now and feel I'm just getting good at it. So you have to have the professionalism, you have to have the accountability. Let's trade that off for higher pay. We need to fund education. This community is applauded for its MAPS efforts and all we've done, but we kind of need to break communities away from the stranglehold of state control, which is going on here as well. We need to look at the state funding formula for problems that may exist in disincentives to raise local revenue for funding education. I ask you, what do you pay your lowest administrative assistant in your offices today? Well, what we're looking at is a $38,500 salary level, not including fringes. And how many of you would be willing to take on the responsibility that teachers have and deal with all the paper grading and all the after-hours work and everything else that goes along with it? If we're going to have a first-class metro area, which we're strongly on the road to achieve, we need to have first-class K-12 education in Oklahoma.
Bob, Texas and Arkansas really come after our qualified teachers and really sweeten the pot to attract them, don't they?
That's what I'm hearing. That's what I'm hearing.
So I'd zoom out just a little bit and make just a couple comments. I was getting ready the other morning and had my financial morning news program in the background. And I was walking through the bedroom. I heard a question being asked. I think the person being asked the question was Warren Buffett. And the question asked was, is the American dream still alive? The American dream of achieving prosperity, is the American dream still alive? And Mr. Buffett answered the question in an interesting fashion. He said, yeah, I think the dream for American prosperity, I think it's still alive. But he said, your zip code matters. He says, I think which zip code, the zip code that you grow up in is a high indicator of the probability your access to the American dream for prosperity. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. And in reality, I think in Oklahoma, we do have a lot of zip codes, a lot of pockets where educational opportunities are really pretty impressive. The challenge is, how do you extend those same opportunities to more and more zip codes? Bob talked a little bit about funding issues. I think the other side of that discussion is also, how do you innovate, right? How do you make the delivery, how do you innovate within the educational system to make the system more productive and allow a better delivery and a better transference of the knowledge and the skill sets that you're trying to transfer? This is a challenge that, of course, we all face in higher education. We talk about it all the time in our meetings. How do we innovate? What can we do differently? How do we increase productivity in terms of our production of education? And so it's going to really be a challenge of both matching funding and new paradigms, requiring a paradigm shift in innovative ways to educate. But I would say that the problem is not likely to go away. Right? This morning, as I was driving into work, I listened to an entire story on news radio about the challenges of urban public education. And as Oklahoma City continues to urbanize and grow into a major urban metro area, we're going to continue to face challenges just like every other major city faces. How do you address your challenges of urban public education? And I think funding and innovation are two possible avenues to address that issue, but I think it's going to be a continued challenge, particularly as we try to meet labor demands as we go forward.
Yes, I was just at the Federal Reserve Bank branch in Denver, and they kind of bring regional economists in to talk about what's going on. And so my question to the person from Colorado I've known forever is, you might be aware that they have limitations on their taxes, that they have a taxpayer bill of rights, so it really limits their education funding. And over the years that they've had this, they've moved from very high in a per pupil spending at the higher ed and K through 12 to very low nationally. But one reason they've kind of got away with it with the higher ed is people want to move to Colorado, so they have an easy time getting high-tech companies, people with college degrees to move there. My question to him was, I said, well, don't these people want to have good education for their children? Because these are educated people, and educated people always worry about education for their children. He goes, oh yes, the first thing they ask is, what school district should I put my kids in? And so when they have the flexibility with property taxes to create these really good districts in parts of Denver, these people will go and live there. But if you don't have that flexibility, then you don't have that statewide. And they also just had a referendum they just voted down, in which they were going to increase some tax rates to try to extend this education funding statewide. Because even though there's some districts that are wealthy and have high property values and can fund education well, there's many areas that can't. Now, they voted that down, but that's an issue for them, is can they get to prosperity, as Russell said, spread out, not just in a few places where they can, they're well funded in education.
A little quick diversion. What other innovation could we have in the educational arena in Oklahoma City? We tend to look at best practices, and then we decide what we're going to address, and we all do it together. We have a shared vision. I don't mean to put you on the spot, since that was off script, but any ideas?
I think innovation in education is tremendously difficult. One, because the paradigm is so entrenched and inertia tends to continue, right, the same delivery. And I think the second is there aren't a lot of incentives for individual pockets of schools or districts to take the risk and the cost associated with innovation. And to Dan's point about trying to spread the opportunities around, this is also a challenge to try to decide, are we, as a society, is the objective here that every zip code has to be elevated simultaneously and in sync together? Or are we okay with the idea that some zip codes may innovate and perform differently than other zip codes? I think in education historically, particularly public education, this has been a challenge about whether or not we need to move an entire state or an entire nation simultaneously. Or are we okay with different pockets achieving at different levels and innovating within those areas? Certainly, as you look at our current Education Secretary, Arne Duncan, has been more than just a little controversial on both sides, taking criticisms from all angles for trying to be innovative, right? And people critical of the innovations. And again, that's not my particular area, so I wouldn't be critical one or the other. But just to point out that it's sort of an emotional, contentious issue. This idea of how do we innovate and change, and to what extent are we willing to allow certain areas to do different things from other areas? And the Common Core discussion we're having right now speaks to that challenge.
Okay, thank you.
I would just say that it's important that students be aware of the career opportunities that are out there in the world that come with increased education and training. So I think our vocational education, or career tech, we call it now, is an important feature of our educational system that needs to be exploited to perhaps, in particular for Oklahoma City's problem with a high concentration of Hispanic origin students, it would be great to get more exposure to career opportunities that come with increased education and training. So I don't know how much that's innovation, but just maybe marshaling forces that we have already in place and put them to work to that end.
Sounds great. There are a number of items in the news that are top of mind to all of us right now, and I'm going to name three of them: the Affordable Health Care Act, the recent government shutdown, and energy. Dan, why don't you address a hot potato? The Affordable Health Care Act has created a lot of uncertainty of local businesses in the greater Oklahoma City region. Oklahoma was one of 27 states that opted out for creating its own health care exchange. Look into your crystal ball, and if you have the answer, you'll be the one in 18 million. Provide us some ideas what business owners and their employees might expect in the coming months and years as a result.
Okay, thank you. Yes, it is a hot potato, and I will preface this by saying I am a regional and urban economist, not a health economist. So I might just have opinions like everybody else. But I think it turns out that not only did we have to pass the bill to see what was in it, we had to start implementing it to see what was in it. And that's not always a positive thing. Sort of the implications, and I think it was advertised that besides increasing access, that this was going to contain cost. And one of the principal architects of that was Jonathan Gruber at MIT. And apparently he's even changing his predictions about whether it's saving costs versus increasing costs. And there's some aspects to it. And this is, Russell mentioned Warren Buffett. I'm sort of like Warren Buffett personally, so I'll just preface it. I thought I would have rather controlled the cost before changing assets than the reverse. Because I think that this, along with the medical, the Medicare prescription benefit that was added under Bush, we've added two things that really make demand more inelastic, which makes it more difficult to control costs. Neither one of those really addressed the cost control, really changed access. Personally, I would have liked to address the cost aspect first, and though access, I understand, is important. And I think things that they're thinking why it's going to increase costs. Now, they've delayed the mandate on large employers, so for a year. So for the large employers, they can kind of wait to see what's politically going to happen, and I'm not going to try to guess on that. But for small employers and people who are kind of trying to purchase it on their own, there's a real possibility that they're going to see rising costs, and then this is going to be a problem. One of the reasons is that all the policies now, at least of course politically, I don't know what they're going to do to change it, are supposed to have essential benefits, right? So there are many policies that didn't have all the benefits that are now prescribed, and so they were cheaper. So now if you're going to make all the policies have all of the benefits that they would like, those become more expensive. They also have a provision where that the beneficiaries are only limited on how much they actually have to pay out of pocket. So of course, if you're going to do that, the only way that insurance companies can make that up is if there's a higher premium. But I think the real problem and I told you, I'm not a healthcare economist, so I go read and try to figure this out myself. But reading just even the opinions of people who actually were behind the Massachusetts plan, which was sort of the predecessor to this, is what we have a problem is the benefits and expenses start in 2014. Now, the way that this is going to work is we were going to get all the young and otherwise healthy people into the market, and they were going to subsidize those might be older, those might be less healthy. But apparently the way it's structured, from what I can understand, is that the expenses are going to occur right away. The penalty for not participating only gradually goes up over the years. So what you can get over a near term is a real adverse selection outcome where the healthiest stay out, the neediest and unhealthiest go in, and the expenses rise, and then that's going to drive up premiums. And that's not even counting for the fact what the cost might be to get this website thing fixed and other things that might occur. So I think I'll stop there. I'm sure half people say yes, half said no what I said, so I'll let others pine in.
They may ask more questions during the Q&A anyway about it. Russell, were you dying about an answer here?
Yeah, I just say anecdotally, I was working with several insurance companies regionally here at the time the Affordable Care Act was passed, and it really made the comment as we worked in their leadership teams and their strategy sessions that that really the large burden was going to fall on the insurance company. That they were going to have to try to find a way to walk this tightrope between how do you craft the policies that are going to be required that meet the criteria now of the an eligible policy. How do you avoid then doing that and avoid raising premiums, and at the same time, how do you go out and expand your premium pool to make sure that that your risk is spread appropriately? And I just said for years as I worked with these companies, I said I really just empathize with you. I mean, this is really going to fall on the insurer, and I really feel badly for you and the challenge that you're facing. And then I saw my premium increase this year, and it eroded my empathy more than just a little bit, right? So suddenly I was much less empathetic as I saw what would happen to my premiums going forward next year.
Right? It's all about me, right?
And then I would only say, as to everything that Dan said, one of the things that we are looking at locally is the role that this will play, combined with the budget talks we're going to have to go through in February again, and really trying to look at the holiday Christmas sell season, and really trying to get a sense of how much is this uncertainty about, am I going to have coverage, am I not going to have coverage if I'm on an individual plan, or if I have a business plan, how much, I've now gone through my enrollment period, what are my premiums going to look like next year? And how will this combine with all the other factors over the next 2 or 3 months to curtail what is already looking to shape up to be a relatively modest national Christmas sell season? So we are looking for some of those impacts to show up locally on our tax receipts.
Okay, and Bob, did you have?
Real quickly, just as an insight on gamesmanship and where I think all of this is heading, I think that we've been placed on a channel of a trajectory, if you will, that's ultimately going to lead to a single-payer system. I think that was the design. I think we're seeing more and more firms saying, well, we're not going to provide health insurance anymore. And I'm not sure that this wasn't the plan all along in a game theory kind of manner. So ultimately, we may be going down that route, and we'll end up with a single-payer system for many and luxury health care for others who can afford it. I think that's the ultimate where this is heading.
Wow. Well, I have 3 questions remaining that I want to, maybe we kind of speed up because I want to make sure we have plenty of time to ask the audience. But, all right, Bob, this is coming to you. Standard & Poor's estimated that the recent government shutdown took an estimated $24 billion out of the U.S. economy. However, others believe that the economy and the business community function just fine without them. So as we face additional cuts through sequestration and potentially another government shutdown early next year, what effects, if any, do you think that the shutdown created in Oklahoma? And what future effects does this type of environment have on our economy, particularly Tinker Air Force Base?
I'll make this very brief. I think that we hadn't seen very much in the way of impact of what happened with the last shutdown. Certainly some of our labor statistics we like to look at are coming out a little later. That seemed to be a victim of the shutdown. But I think that while we haven't had much impact as yet, we still have a long road ahead of us. Certainly these issues are set to come up again very quickly in the Congress, and we can expect a lot of brinksmanship on the part of both parties. We're already having the Senate presumably went nuclear yesterday with so the battles are going to continue. The brinksmanship will be there. In Oklahoma, I think the biggest threat to us, of course, is the huge number of facilities we have and the dollars that we have from the federal government for our not only Tinker but Chanute, Altus, Fort Sill, the munitions facility in McAllister. In fact, we rank 9th in the nation in dollars that are personal income is generated from government and government enterprises, 9th in the nation, to give you some idea of the outside dependency that we are in this state for government, large S. So I think the defense budget is very much going to be trimmed, and it's something that we have to prepare ourselves for in the state, I think.
Yeah, I know we're short on time, but I think this is the appropriate time for me personally to apologize to this audience. It was this time last year that we opened this conversation by talking about sequestration. We had a long explanation of what sequestration was, its history, and we concluded by saying that you could forget everything we just said because it would never be implemented, right? And so I think last year...
And you're an economist?
That's right. Last year we said it was such a bad idea. It was the least thoughtful, least articulate way to cut spending. It would never happen. Don't worry about it, right? Here's what it is, but don't worry. And then, of course, it happened. And then not only did it happen, but now it's gone so far as we move into February and the new budget talks, it's actually become one of the cornerstones of negotiations, that any resolution must maintain the principles set forth in sequestration. It's not only become accepted, but now it's become such a good idea that it's part of this. And so I just feel like we should apologize for our comments last year.
I think they're fine with it.
The only thing I would add is from what I've been hearing and from our national forecaster, it doesn't seem that consumer confidence has been too shaken by what's going on with the government. So even though there should be still modest Christmas season for maybe some other reasons, but it doesn't appear that the government shutdown and the possibility of it happening again is having any influence. So that's the one positive.
Okay, let's 30 seconds each for the next two questions. Russell, this one's coming to you. People still sometimes compare the recent Oklahoma oil and natural gas renaissance to the boom in the early 1980s. How is what happened in the early 80s different than today, and should we be concerned or optimistic?
Optimistic, should definitely be optimistic. I think the paradigm of trying to put your assets and your leases in place during periods of low prices so that you can return a high yield during periods of high prices, that paradigm has now shifted to a paradigm of optimal extraction of an existing resource base. I was at a conference just a couple of weeks ago, and an analyst was saying that he had just gotten back from Russia and was speaking to the natural gas industry there. And he was saying what they don't recognize about what's happening in the United States is that in the United States right now, on the extraction side, every 5 or 10 cents matters, right? Every bit of cost you can contain on the extraction side matters towards you trying to get your 12 or 15% return on your asset. And so the cycle that we're about to go through, I think, is really going to be driven through innovation, technology, research and development. I think this is evidenced by the GE Research Laboratory. It's only research laboratory dedicated to a singular industry located here in Oklahoma City. I think the recognition is it's really going to be all about technology development how do I contain extraction costs, and how do I get my 12 or 15% return off this asset, even when prices are only $3.75 or $4.25 an MMBTU. And so I think the paradigm, I think very optimistic going forward. I think the industry has long legs, and I think the paradigm will shift now from periods of high return and low return to how do I get my 12 or 15% return year after year after year, and it's going to be in cost containment. It's going to be in lowering the cost, technology development, cost containment on the extraction side.
Great point. All right, wrap-up question for y'all before we turn it over to the audience. It's expected that Janet Yellen will be confirmed to replace Ben Bernanke as the Federal Reserve Chairman. How will history treat Ben Bernanke, and what would his legacy be? This is for everybody.
I think Bob wanted to talk about this the most. But if you want to collect your thoughts,
Way to
I'll
throw
start.
him under the bus.
Let me start out by saying this is my opinion. It's not the University of Oklahoma. It's not to be held responsible for anything I say here. But my prognostication is that Ben Bernanke will ultimately suffer the same damage as has, what was his name? Chairman Alan Greenspan. What a pathetic figure. We see him parading around with his new book on talk television lately, trying to say that he was only human, and yes, he's not very good at forecasting and his models didn't work, but I'm sorry, but buy my book anyway. I didn't see the financial crisis coming, I engaged in a lot of activities that anytime there was a financial problem on Wall Street, well, I thought it was important for me to go and rescue Wall Street from it. And of course, I didn't realize that Wall Street might get the thought that maybe they could engage in increasing speculation because as a consequence, they have the Fed always behind their back, right, backing them up if they get into any trouble with over speculation. And certainly I didn't imagine that banks wouldn't be watching their books to make sure that they weren't engaged in a lot of shenanigans and that people were actually doing illegal things. And yes, maybe I could have done a better job of bank regulation, which is certainly in the legislation for the Fed. So every time it was always cavalry to the rescue with Greenspan. It was always a lot of emphasis on whatever could be done to shore things up in times of trouble. In other words, let's mitigate, let's lessen any kind of penalty that might be associated with long-term capital management engaged in activities that lead to huge losses. Where has America the place where you're free to succeed, but also the free to fail as well, without being bailed out from some central planning-like agency such as the Federal Reserve System we have today. So I think a good, and I've actually heard that the Fed has officially adopted a theme song, "I'm Forever Blowing Bubbles." And yes, the Fed should be out there, should be dealing with the issues that are there, and Bernanke was part of this cabal back in the Greenspan years that kept interest rates way too low after the 2001 recession, that fomented the housing bubble, which I'm not sure wasn't a policy design to begin with. But Bernanke's widely applauded for the rescue of the economy on Time magazine cover and all that. But my opinion is that if you start a fire and then help put it out, you're still an arsonist.
You've authored a blog, haven't you?
Just to close real quickly, Milton Friedman, possibly our last great economist, is rolling over in his grave with all of this QE, quantitative easing forever, that we're seeing now. Milton said we could replace the Fed with a computer, and I would like to second that.
Okay, Dan and Russell, you might lace your comments with the Q&A that we get from the audience because we are really short on time. But if you're dying, you do for it. Any questions we have? They won't bite. Even Bob. No questions? Come on. Yes, Pete. Oh, here you go.
Dependence on energy. Now, I know we have really low electric utility rates that are really trying to help with that.
This is not a paid commercial.
But could you address the diversification? I know there may be a belief that we're more and more diversified. I'd like your opinion.
Yeah, so I do think that we are more diversified, and I think, again, so for time constraints, let's just talk the energy industry. When you look at the energy industry, where they were a generation ago and where they are today, the makeup of the employment inside the building is completely different than it was a generation ago. I was talking to a student of mine recently, and he said when he was hired at a large independent here in the metro area as a supply chain management specialist, he was the 8th person in the division. And he said over the course of the next 6 or 7 years, they were just hiring, at the time we were talking, they were just hiring the 200th person for their division. And that's common across the industry. So when you look across the occupations inside the building, you have a lot more occupations like supply chain management, like systems administration, like you have all these other occupations in the buildings that are transferable skill sets. And so while even though you drive around the city and it may not look any more diverse than it has been in the past, it really is because the skill sets inside the building are much more diverse than they've ever been, and they're much more transferable across industries. As we've tracked students who have, we have students in our programs that have moved pretty seamlessly from inside the energy industry to outside the energy industry, taking their skill sets to other companies. So I think there is a little more diversity than there has been previously, and I do think, at least on the rate side, in Oklahoma, we've just been through a period of making a capital for labor substitution in the manufacturing sector. And so we've really upgraded the capital stock in our manufacturing sector. We've seen that even though employment in that sector has been going down, the value of production in the sector has been going up. We've seen an upgrade in the capital stock. And so I think and we still have the low land prices. I think there's still a lot of strength left in Oklahoma's manufacturing sector as you think about economic geography and what's happening. And so I think that there's some strength there to grow on and further diversification. I really do.
I would add, though, I would still go back to the education aspect, and particularly in terms of what we call STEM education, the science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. I mean, that I think is going to be the key to having diversity in the high-paying, high-value industries. And that's something I think that's increasingly recognized across the country. There's a certain amount of academic research that shows not only the benefits of having them directly, that they seem to create wage benefits for people in non-STEM occupations, even for those not in STEM. So I think this is still the challenge we had mentioned before with labor force and education. I think that's going to be linked to diversity. And if we don't address that, we're going to mostly see STEM in the energy industry and not elsewhere here.
Any other questions? Don't be shy. I know we're holding you up from your main course. Well, obviously, y'all had all the great ideas and answers. So please thank our wonderful professional experts. I tell you what, please enjoy your main course. We'll be back with the program shortly, and please look at the screen for all our sponsors. And thanks again to Bob, Russell, and Dan. Y'all are tremendous. We're very proud of you.
Well, I hope you enjoyed our panel of economists who focused on our regional situation, and I hope you enjoy your lunch and continue enjoying lunch. Just try to do it quietly if you can. That would be helpful, so appreciate that. At the beginning, I talked about not only that we were going to have a panel focusing on the regional economy, that we would have a keynote speaker who was well-educated, widely respected, and followed widely, and he's an economist, an innovator, educator, and so I'm pleased to introduce our keynote speaker today, Todd Buchholz, who is the CEO and co-founder of the educational software company Sproglit, which is really based on the Math Arrow invention of his, which is a matrix that helps, and you can obviously explain a lot better than I can, helps make numbers more intuitive for children. He's also a frequent commentator on the state of the economy, the financial markets, and in business and culture. He brings his experience as a former White House Director of Economic Policy, a Managing Director of the $15 billion Tiger Hedge Fund, and as an award-winning Harvard economics teacher to the cutting edge of economics, fiscal politics, finance, and business strategy. He is a frequent guest on ABC News, PBS, CBS, and he recently hosted his own special on CNBC. He's also he likes to take risk on his investments, and he was one of the founding producers of the Broadway show, The Jersey Boys, which is one of my favorites. Buchholz also authored numerous critically acclaimed and best-selling books, including Market Shock, 9 Economic and Social Upheavals That Will Shake Our Financial Future, the best-selling New Ideas from Dead Economists, New Ideas from Dead CEOs, From Here to Economy, and Lasting Lessons from the Corner Office, which garnered high praise from both the New York Times and the Financial Times. Todd holds advanced degrees in economics and law from Cambridge and Harvard. Please join me in welcoming Todd to Oklahoma City.
Well, thank you, Pete, for that very kind introduction. I mean, you were nice enough to read everything my mother had written down, which is always appreciated. It's great to be here in Oklahoma City. This is not my first visit. I think this is my 4th visit to Oklahoma City. And it's wonderful to be here at a time when Oklahoma City is demonstrating such prosperity, such hope, such optimism for the future. And you know you're in an optimistic place when you're in Oklahoma and you can find murals of the ocean cascading, you know, like that's really, that's aspirational. For all those nice things Pete was kind enough to mention, I have to tell you, when I graduated from college, I actually tried to get a job with an energy company, and I had a series of interviews. And I was told, well, you're going to have to win over the regional manager. And I was told he was a very crusty guy, tough to win over. And I thought, how am I going to establish a rapport with this person who doesn't like young guys right out of school? Well, so I walk into his office, and the first thing I notice is a photo of himself and John Madden. And I think this is great. I love football. We can talk about the playoffs and the Raiders and John Madden. So the first thing I blurt out is, Mr. So-and-so, where did you get that great photo of yourself and John Madden? The guy looks at me and says, that's not John Madden, that's my mother. So off to graduate school for economics, and now my job is to figure out what in the world is going on in the economy. And I really did appreciate the panel we just saw. Dan, Russell, and Robert, I think, did an outstanding job in going over a number of issues, especially at the regional and local level, and some at the national level. I'm going to start at a very macro, trend-like level, and then I'm going to drill down to where exactly I think the economy is at the moment. And I'll talk about the healthcare plan. I'll talk about sequester and the Federal Reserve Board. I was actually just at the Fed yesterday in Washington, D.C. So we'll cover a lot of ground, and we'll do it relatively quickly as well. So I've got my clicker here. First of all, I live in California now, so I thought I'd bring you, there's my former governor. Now this slide, to me, is just a reminder of how our expectations can be turned upside down instantaneously these days. There's Arnold Schwarzenegger. There he is filling up his GM Hummer. Now, because Arnie's still married to Kennedy, it's a hybrid Hummer. So, you know, he's getting upwards of 5-6 miles a gallon on that baby. On the right, I've got Hot Wheels cars. And in fact, I went to Target the other day and I bought myself a new Hot Wheels car, a bright red Pontiac GTO Hot Wheels car. Now, my friend Eric, what is this to scale compared to a real vehicle? We should have rehearsed this. A 2-digit number, between 63 and 65. No, 64, I think so. But do you realize, in a symbol of how the world turned upside down right before our eyes, just a couple years ago, suddenly the market capitalization, the value of all the shares of General Motors, shrunk to less than the value of the Hot Wheels cars. Yeah, oh my God, Hot Wheels could have bought GM. They didn't want to, but they did. You shouldn't be laughing. You're an American taxpayer. You bought GM. I bought GM. Actually, if you look at today's paper, the Treasury Department just sold off our last shares of General Motors. And let's be honest, the American automobile industry is actually one of the few sectors in the economy that is actually doing well now. But we never imagined we'd live in a world where icons would crumble right before our eyes. We live in this era where speed is of the essence. The very moment Ben Bernanke at the Federal Reserve Board or Janet Yellen soon at the Federal Reserve Board leadership, the moment they turn on their microphone, I grab hold of my wallet, because within the slightest statement they make, within a second, the markets can go up 100 points, down 100 points, 300, 500, 1,000 points. For 4 years, I had to listen to my old buddy Tim Geithner, our former Treasury Secretary. I had to listen to, because anything he said could shake the markets. In fact, it irked me because I worked with Tim years ago. In fact, I worked with Tim before he made the money he forgot to pay his taxes on. But, you know, for 4 years, he was shaping the markets. Here's a question we keep asking ourselves. Think back, I've got a daughter in 7th grade and another one who's a freshman in high school. Think back to when you were in 7th or 8th grade and you had that biology textbook. And remember, they had the overlays, those transparencies of the insides of a frog, right? The muscular system, the circulatory system, the respiratory system. We used to be able to do something like that as economists with business cycles and say, okay, well, X months into the recession, we'll begin to see this sort of change, this kind of recovery, the jobless rate should, those models, those transparencies don't work anymore. And I've grappled with this, as have others. Why? And I've concluded we live in what I call the age of anxiety. There are 3 forces up there. These 3 forces raise the overall standard of living in the world. They make the world economy more efficient, but they lead many of us and our neighbors to stay up late at night around the kitchen table wondering how we're going to make ends meet. What are these 3 forces, and what is this paradox? All right, upper left, there's the Berlin Wall. 1989, President Ronald Reagan. If you haven't seen it, the statue, it's a magnificent statue here of President Reagan. President Reagan demands Mr. Gorbachev tear down this wall. And the wall came down. I was serving in the White House in '89 when the wall came down. I could talk to you about the politics of Poland and Berlin, but my friends at the chamber didn't ask me to come here to talk about the politics of Poland. I'm supposed to talk about the economy and finance here. Now, what does the Berlin Wall 4,000 or 5,000 miles away have to do with us? Well, for every square foot of Berlin Wall cement that crumbled to the ground as dust, hundreds and hundreds of workers who'd been trapped behind that wall, trapped under communism, were suddenly free. Well, free to do what? Free to vote, free to travel, free to start a newspaper, but also free to compete. Well, who do they compete against? Against you, against me, against your neighbors, against somebody writing software in Austin or assembling textiles in Tulsa. One reason why the economic models of the Federal Reserve Board and Harvard and UCLA and all the great research institutions didn't do a good job predicting anything. Of course, OU and University of Oklahoma, those models work perfectly, but everybody else failed. Why? Because when you introduce hundreds of millions of workers into the worldwide workforce, and then you add the opening of India and China, it's billions flooding into the worldwide workforce, stomping on labor rates. Look at the chopsticks in that slide. Go back to the slide for a moment. America's middle class is in a pincer movement, trapped between 2 prongs. Prong number 1, you speak to friends and neighbors. How you doing? They say, well, you know, I kept my job, that's good, but I haven't gotten a pay raise in a long time. And you say, well, you know, who's getting a pay raise? The Great Recession just ended. They say, wait a minute, hold on. I don't think I've gotten a real pay raise since, 1998. Well, why can't you get a pay raise? Because I'm competing against 1 billion people that didn't seem to have existed 10 years ago. Prong number 2, when I go to the gas station to fill up my car, I'm paying $3.50 a gallon. In California, where I live, more like $4.25 a gallon. I'm paying more for chicken wings. Commodity prices around the world were pushed up because those 1 billion new workers expect not bicycles, but automobiles. Not 1 meal a day, but 3 meals a day. And then we've had the amazing merger and acquisition booms that take place. And that can shake confidence. Sure, it may make companies more efficient, but if you're working for some company that just got taken over, you don't know about your job security. To me, the M&A boom got kicked off most dramatically. I think it was 1998, actually. I turned on CNN, and I was shocked to hear that Daimler-Benz and Chrysler, two companies that had made tanks that fought each other in World War II, were merging. Now, we all grew up with the idea of the Big Three in Detroit, right? The Big Three. And what does that phrase mean anymore? Big Three? You might as well talk to Grandpa about Studebaker or Packard to say the big. There's a story about the Daimler executive in Stuttgart. When the merger's announced, he calls together his staff in a big conference room. He's got handouts and leaflets and flyers explaining flow charts. Finally, a guy in the back raises his hand. He says, "Boss, I understand who I report to, what my division does now, but what I don't understand is in German. How do you pronounce Daimler, Benz, Chrysler, Well, he stumbled over the word Plymouth. Well, the Daimler executive at the podium, he couldn't say Plymouth either. Finally, he throws up his hands and he says, "It's pronounced Daimler-Benz. The Chrysler is silent." Which is pretty much the way that one worked out. Oh, look, but Chrysler's now in the hands of Fiat, and it's actually the most successful part of Fiat at this moment. But my point is, those three paradoxical forces based on globalization and financial transactions and M&A basically will make the world more efficient, but it doesn't mean it makes it a better life for everybody. And that ends up sapping confidence. Because we've all been asking ourselves, when is consumer confidence really going to come back? When is business confidence really going to come back? Trillions of dollars on the sidelines that have not been deployed. This helps explain why that confidence has just not returned. Look, a little bit more on globalization. I took this from my daughter's high school history textbook. Marco Polo, 700 years ago, trade between the edges of Europe. There's Constantinople, Istanbul today, and Asia. What were they trading back in Marco Polo's day? It's a little fuzzy from where you're seated. I'll tell you, they were trading dates, figs, prunes, breakfast for old people. That's what it was all about. Your kid asks you, who was Marco Polo? You just say breakfast for old people. But those silk routes and spice routes are back, but what are they trading? Now it's petrochemical flows. I've done a study for Exxon, Sinopec, 1999, ranked 50th in the world, Chinese petrochemical company. By 2005, it moved up to 7th in the world, and it's retained that level. And of course, we've got all sorts of financial flows and so on. I like that little cartoon here. This demonstrates China's hunger for commodities. And now it's trying to reach into Africa to secure commodities for the future. Okay, I've got another map here. I want you to raise your hand if you've got close family or friends in one of the following places. Raise your hand. Any other Californians here? Keep them up. This is a really short aerobics test. California, Florida, good. Keep them up. Keep them up. California, Florida, Scottsdale, Arizona, or Phoenix, good, good. And Las Vegas. Okay. I'm going to slip behind the wall here. Those without your hands up, I want you to pick up the nearest club and beat the hell out of everybody with their hand raised. Yeah, because California, Florida, Scottsdale, and Las Vegas destroyed the entire world's financial system. They did. With the rampant residential real estate speculation, they just, look, this guy back here raised his hand from Florida. Because of him, there's some person in Athens, Greece tonight reaching for a hero sandwich, a half-eaten one out of a dumpster because of him. I'm not going to spend a lot of time dwelling on the past, but there are just a couple lessons that still apply and apply in the future, and that's why I'm talking about the Great Recession. All right, how did we get into that mess? Fundamental lesson of human life, skin in the game, skin in the game. If people don't have skin in the game, they take excess risk. That's the way it is. Now, what happened in real estate? I'll tell you, I live in San Diego. You started with Mr. and Mrs. I deserve 4 bedrooms and a jacuzzi. Even though I never saved a dime in my life, Mr. and Mrs. I deserve 4 bedrooms and a jacuzzi. They went to the mortgage broker, the banker, they got the loan. In some cases, they didn't put down a down payment. In certain cases, now I have to tell you, I thought this was an urban myth. I thought it was just some story people made up. But I checked it out because I personally spoke to some bankers who admitted to this. In certain cases, Mr. and Mrs. I deserve 4 bedrooms and a jacuzzi, got a mortgage, and they didn't even show a 1040 tax return to the bank. I asked the bankers, how is this possible? You lend money to Mr. and Mrs. I deserve 4 bedrooms and a jacuzzi. You don't demand a down payment. You don't even demand their tax return. The banker said, well, Todd, calm down. Just remember, let's put it in context. Everything was going up. We were behind in the paperwork. Funding costs were low. And besides, you know, we didn't want to embarrass our customers. Embarrass? This is a couple that would willingly wrestle each other to the ground on the Jerry Springer show, and we're worried about embarrassing these people? Now, my concern as we're sort of leaving the Great Recession behind is that we have this global backlash against the very idea of earning a profit. We have a global condemnation of the very idea of anyone earning more than the median income. We have trade wars that break out. It's very difficult to create a global economic upswing when popular sentiment is to stomp on anyone who's trying to create a global economic upswing. So President Obama had slapped 35% tariffs on Chinese tires. Maybe that was a good idea, maybe it was a bad idea, I'm not going to debate that. But the Chinese retaliated. They put 100% tariffs on American chickens. So you've got chicken farmers in Arkansas, Maryland, and Delaware who are making less money because of an argument about low-grade rubber tires. We had the Occupy movement out in force. I was in New York City on May 1st, the last time they were throwing bricks through plate glass windows at Starbucks. On behalf of the 99%, they say, as if the problem with 99% of the population is the price of a latte. But this is what we've got. This worldview that you begrudge anyone who tries to create some extra income. All right, let's look at some other places in the world, and let's talk about government finances. Are we all Greek? There's the Parthenon, or the Acropolis on the Parthenon, which is a kind of fitting symbol for Greece's finances, but they're not alone. Let's look at this chart here. There are, well, look, the horizontal line at the bottom, which our economist friends would call the x-axis, is debt as a percentage of GDP. All right? The left side, the vertical line on the left, is the fiscal balance or deficit as a percentage of GDP. The only thing you need to gather from this is you don't want to live in the southeast quadrant of this map. That tells you your country is broke because the deficit, the debt level is high, and it's getting worse every year. Who's there? We are. The US, UK, Ireland, Japan, India, France, Italy, the Eurozone. Who's in the enviable northwest quadrant? Mexico? Mexico? Turkey? Brazil, South Korea, all the countries we now have to borrow from. By the way, there's one country from the G7 that's missing here. Is anyone here possibly from Canada? Any Oh, yes. What's your name, sir? John. John, on behalf of the, 500 of us in this room, I've got a question for you. Could we borrow $18 trillion? Would you mind? I mean, we're not going to waste it. This time we have a plan. You know, we're going to use a... All right, so Canada actually has its finances in pretty good shape. When I was in Athens, a shopkeeper said to me, well, for the next 30 years, we all work for the Germans. Now we wonder, who do we work for other than, you know, our friend here? How did we get into this mess? Let's do a little thought experiment. Another question. And in a room this size, I'd expect a couple hands go up. Can any of you trace your ancestors to the Mayflower? Anyone do that? If you usually get 100 or 200, okay. Well, let's do a little thought experiment. Let's pretend all of us are coming over on the Mayflower, right? We're all at 1620, we're crossing the North Atlantic, it's rocky, it's cold, it's rainy, and we're gonna go below deck because we're gonna have a meeting. Because we gotta come up with a couple rules for how we're going to run this new community of ours. At that moment, would any of us step forward and say, well, principle number one, 1/3 to 1/2 of us should not have to pay any taxes? Wouldn't that immediately doom a new community? Anyone here belong to a book club? You guys, any book club? Oh, good, because I've got a lot of books that I've written. You need to, you know, start reading them. Can you imagine having a book club and half the people saying, you know, I'm not going to bother buying the book or reading the book, but I'll come for the snacks, and you better provide better snacks next time. I'd like the little lamb chops. Now, I understand that this sounds a little reminiscent of when Mitt Romney got in trouble with his whatever it was, 47, 49%, which he took out of context. He handled it, you know, in a clumsy way. You know, it really was a debacle to discuss that. But it doesn't mean there's not a little germ of concern about the distribution of taxes and distribution of work and so on in this country. Look, before the Great Recession, we were up to about a third of the population not having any federal tax liability, and now that number is in the 40s. I'm not here to make a partisan Republican speech. I'll tell you, Franklin Roosevelt and his advisors, a great Democratic president, they were honest and they were smart. They created the Social Security system in the 1930s, and they set the retirement age at 65. Why? Because in the 1930s, the average 65-year-old was dead, you got it, dead. Do you know Franklin Roosevelt didn't live to age 65? Now get this, I want you to picture in your mind President Lyndon Johnson. Got a photo of Lyndon Johnson in your mind? He sets up Medicare in the 1960s, retirement age 65. Do you realize Lyndon Johnson didn't even live to 65? He looked like hell. He looked like 88 when he was a 14-year-old. Really? Now, let's just look at Social Security, the upper right chart there. In the 1940s, for every retiree, you had about 40 or so workers, right? So that's like 6 tables. All these people here in these center tables, they'd work full-time, take a tiny bit from their paycheck, and one person retires. Well, they wouldn't notice that. 1950s, about 16, 17 people, that's, 2 tables or so, supporting one, chipping in a little bit to support one person. That was no problem. Now we're at the point where it's just 2 per, we're getting to the point where it's 2 per retiree. It's just my friends, Kurt and Eric right here supporting one person on the golf course. It's a good thing they're rich. But it just doesn't work. Now, I suppose there are other ways to address this increasing life expectancy. We could try to reverse it. We could take away the lane markers in the roads, no more bicycle helmets, and go into old people's homes and you rip out the guardrails on the bathtubs. I suppose you could try that. I don't think that's the best way to handle our entitlement spending problem. But, that's as likely, it seems, as anything else the government is thinking of. I just flew in last night from Washington, D.C., where I had meetings at the Department of Education and the White House and at the Federal Reserve Board, and I was reminded a friend of mine had said to me, you know what, I think the problem with Washington, D.C. is I think there are too many of those congressmen must be on drugs. So I think there should be mandatory drug testing. And I thought about it, and I said, Bob, I don't really think so. I'd prefer mandatory IQ testing, because drug testing is expensive. If they fail the test, you've got to provide therapy and rehabilitation. Whereas if they fail the IQ test, once a moron, always a moron. Okay, let's talk about where the economy, look, nothing's being done about entitlement spending, so the long-run debt picture is not looking particularly good. Oh, by the way, I should point out, I, by and large, among other economists, tend to be more on the optimistic side. So I am not one of these perma-bears. And in fact, I'm pretty much the first person I know that in January of '09, after Lehman Brothers fell, thought that U.S. GDP would turn positive by the fall, which turned out to be right. I'm not telling you that I'm right a lot. What I'm telling you is I'm not someone predisposed to tell you negative stuff and, and take great comfort in being a grump. That's not the way I think about the world. But I don't see much progress being made right now on entitlements. All right, what about the economy? FOE. 3 critical levers to think about where the economy is headed. F, Federal Reserve Board. O, oil. E, the euro. Take them one at a time. F, Federal Reserve Board, has rewritten everything. 0% interest rates. The Fed used to only lend to their own member banks. Now they'll lend to state banks, mortgage banks. They used to only accept their own short-term paper as collateral. Now they'll accept mortgage debt, car loan. They'll accept anything. Here's a cheap way to make some money. Find the nearest Target, Walmart, Toys R Us. Go down the board game aisle. Buy up all the Monopoly board games you can. Reach in and take that cash. Anyone remember who's on the cash in Monopoly? It used to be Art Linkletter when I was a kid. I don't know if it still is. But take the fake money. Go to the airport, get on a cheap flight to Washington, D.C. On Southwest. You'll change in Tulsa, then you'll go to Spokane, Washington, San Diego, a couple other places. But then I want you to hitchhike to Ben Bernanke's office, soon to be Janet Yellen's office. There she is. She's changing the name tags. Bang on their door. You hand them the fake Art Linkletter Monopoly cash, and they will print you real Ben Franklins in return, because that's what they've been doing, for which they've taken a lot of criticism. Obviously, Bob is a big and an articulate critic of the quantitative easing. I tend not to be as critical. I think the Fed has overstayed its welcome now in the quantitative easing. But I do think that driving down interest rates across the yield curve are the principal reason why the U.S. economy has actually eked out positive GDP since '09. Now, has it been a triple plus? No, it's been weak, it's been faint, it fades from view. But I think monetary policy has been actually very powerful. Now, I think they've overstayed their welcome. I think they should be tapering, and I don't quite understand why they've not begun that process. But F has tried to hold up the economy. The price of oil, now clearly, in Oklahoma, in this region, there's some that benefit from a higher price of oil. There's no doubt about that. But if you look at the American consumers across the board, the price of oil has been this constant gravitational pull down, a pull from their wallets, right? And that has dampened other kinds of spending. Now, thankfully, natural gas prices have fallen, and that's offset some of it. But the price of gasoline and oil has been this constant drag for the general economy. Now, what about E, the euro? I'm actually getting kind of, amused. For years now, I keep reading about how the euro is under pressure because of the pigs crisis. The euro is under pressure because of pigs, Portugal, Ireland, Italy, Greece, Spain. The euro is not weak, it's the dollar that's weak. If you don't believe me, take your family for dinner in Paris. You'll pay $100 for a cheeseburger and a Coke, and you'll have to share the cheeseburger. And not just with your own family, but with people at the other tables. So the dollar is weak. It's been terrible for U.S. tourists. But if you've been Caterpillar or John Deere or Boeing, it means your exports have been cheaper, and so that's helped exports. Okay. There's been a flood of money around the world, right? Every central bank has basically taken interest rates down to about 0%. They don't need to dwell on each one. It's pretty much the same curve for everyone. Now, a lot of my friends think that I'm naive and blind to what's going on. They said, Todd, this is the 70s. Just to remind you of the 70s, there's Jimmy Carter, upper left, lower left. Remember he had that singing group, the Village People? Stagflation, a recession that would not end combined with raging inflation. That's where we're going to be. Well, I actually don't see the raging inflation. I remember I was a kid in the 70s, but I remember stagflation, and I remembered when I studied economics the term, and many of you will remember this one, wage price spiral. I don't know about you, but outside of Peyton Manning and a couple other football players, I don't know anyone benefiting from a wage spiral anytime soon. So I don't see that inflation is baked in the cake by most measures, CPI at the top, PPI. And if you don't trust the government numbers, MIT monitors on a daily basis about 1 billion different prices over the internet. And their numbers come fairly consistent with the government numbers. Okay, what about the job market? Thank God, what a pleasure to be here in Oklahoma. What a pleasure to be in a place that is actually creating jobs, where businesses are forming, where even, as was pointed out earlier, with an increasing labor force, you're able to fulfill the needs of laborers to actually get employment. The rest of the country, not so much. It's pretty darn dreary. 7.5% unemployment rate. Now, I told you I'm not here to make a political speech. I'm not here to give the president a hard time. But in my opinion, Obamacare has retarded job formation. I went on NPR about 3 years ago after it was passed, and I said it puts a tripwire in front of small businesses. It says if you've got 50 or more employees, you must provide Obamacare or pay a penalty, 50 or more. Now let me ask you, some of you could answer this personally in your business. If you have 49 employees, would you hire one more today? I wouldn't. What would I do? I'd ask people to stay overtime. I'd pay part-timers and consultants. And those are exactly the kinds of jobs that are being created. This lower right chart, overtime's doing just fine, part-time's doing just fine, but they're not flipping into the full-time work. So will the job market get better in other parts of the country? Yes. But at this unfortunate glacial pace, the job market is slowly repairing itself. Now, what about consumers in the economy? I was on CNBC in February with Maria Bartiromo, who's actually a very smart correspondent for CNBC. She said, Todd, what about the consumer? What about the American consumer? Do they have the wherewithal to keep spending? I said, Maria, there are 3 things the American consumer is willing to buy right now: automobiles, homes, and Greek yogurt. I know this because I have 3 daughters. We have a live-in au pair and my wife. When I open my refrigerator, Chobani just rolls out onto the floor. I'm getting a little bit more concerned about the consumer at this moment, however, because auto sales, while still robust, aren't quite going with the same momentum as they were in the spring. Housing has hit a little bit of a lull across the country. So those were 2 of our 3 primary items. And when I look at consumer discretionary spending across the country, I'm getting a little bit worried. This is the Restaurant Performance Index. That's discretionary spending. You may have seen in the last couple of weeks, Kohl's had announced worrisome sales, and Walmart was concerned about the Christmas season, and Target just today said the same thing. And I think the Health Care Act is contributing to that. There are millions of Americans who are worried that when the mailman comes to their house today, he'll be delivering a thin envelope that says your health care has been canceled. And I think this is weighing on people's minds. So will we avoid a recession? Yeah, my hunch is that we will avoid a recession in 2014, but it's a pretty low trajectory that we're at. These 2 slides at the bottom, as bad as government finances are, households have actually done a heroic job repairing their balance sheets. Now, these slides are old to demonstrate that as recently as the end of 2011, household debt as a percentage of income had declined and delinquency rates on consumer loans had declined. So consumers have done a heroic job trying to balance themselves, if only they can get the government to follow. Okay, I'm just skip that one. Now, I had one experience I wanted to point out. Pete was nice enough to mention Jersey Boys. So I was meeting my wife, and you all run businesses. There's never any excuse for bad service. I just wanted to share this with you. By the way, Pizza Hut is not a sponsor tonight, are they today? No, oh, good. So I was meeting my wife at the theater in New York. And so I was hungry, so I ducked into the Pizza Hut to grab something to eat. And I got to the front of the line. Young woman, big doe eyes, looks at me apologetically and says, I'm sorry, we don't have any more pizza. Like, so what are you now, Hut? Look, the sequester took place last spring. We're going to have the possibility of another government shutdown. I actually think the Republicans will not try to shut down the government again or not play that brinksmanship. Why? Because Obamacare is the headline, the dominant headline. And so it's in the political interest of Republicans just to sort of sit back and say, it's all yours. We're just going to watch. The last thing Republicans want to do is create some new headline, Republicans threaten government shutdown, and so on. By the way, this little boy looks just like a kid who came to our door trick-or-treating a couple of weeks ago. And he came to the door dressed as a doctor. And I looked at him and I said, how old are you? And he said, I'm 10. I said, wow, I bet you could build a better website than the government did for health care. Why do I have 24-hour fitness and McDonald's up there? Part of the uncertainty of the health care plan is the power that apparently the HHS secretary has to just make decisions as she sees fit at any moment. So McDonald's had announced a couple years, they said, hey, you know what, we provide sort of a bare bones health care plan for our workers, but it won't qualify, so we're just going to tear it up. Well, then Kathleen Sebelius, the HHS secretary, oh, don't do that, that would be bad, I'll give you a waiver. Then 24-Hour Fitness and hundreds of others came over and said, you know what, we're not going to qualify, so we'll just end it for our part-time trainers. And she said, I'll give you a waiver, which I thought was kind of fun, because the lesson, as I see it, is whether you're fat or you're thin, you know, you might get a waiver. But this really is now a burden on the economy. And it brings up, inevitably, you get into the political discussion of what happens next. Will Obamacare be repealed? Well, it's not going to be repealed while President Obama is president. The president has veto power. Even if the Republicans want a commanding victory, they're not going to win a veto-proof victory in the House and Senate. So the question is going to be, what happens in 2016? And I try to put up some of the front runners on either side here. So on the Republican side, Chris Christie, Jeb Bush, Marco Rubio, Rand Paul, Paul Ryan, Ted Cruz, Rick Perry, they're, you know, more or less household names for anyone who watches CNN or MSNBC or Fox News. And then conveniently on the left side, the Democratic side, we've got Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden, Elizabeth Warren. She's the new senator from Massachusetts, who is probably the most, just as you'd probably say Ted Cruz and Rand Paul would be the furthest to the right on the Republican side, Elizabeth Warren would be the furthest to the left on the Democratic side. She may run for the nomination attacking Joe Biden and Hillary Clinton, saying these are a bunch of, mainstream people who've just, they might as well be Republicans. I actually, as we were taking the tour today of the museum, I thought it'd be really cool to have Elizabeth Warren here, because remember, she ran for senator in Massachusetts and won, and part of her claim was that she was 1/32nd Cherokee Indian. So I thought there should be a statue here, but it should be like 1/32nd of a person. Maybe a couple toes, I don't know. I also included some dark horse candidates for discussion. On the right, there's Clint Eastwood. He's a dark horse and he can ride a horse, which is that extra benefit. And then we have Alec Baldwin on the lower left, could be a candidate. Okay, before I'm gonna save a few moments for education. I just want to talk about international affairs for a moment and how that impacts things. Just as I'm tired of hearing the euro is weak, I'm tired of hearing that China is going to take over the economic world. It's not happening. China has deep problems. It is soon going to hit the Great Brick Wall of China. If you've been reading the headlines, you might have noticed China said it may liberalize a little bit its one-child policy. That one-child policy is devastating for China's long-term growth. First of all, it's led to a terrible mismatch of young men and young women. Tonight in China, because of, why? One child, it led to female infanticide, female adoptions abroad, and now this terrible mismatch of young men and young women. Tonight in China, there are 60 million young guys who cannot get a date. You got 65 million young, randy, frustrated guys who can't get a date. You got a problem, right? And then China is aging. In 20 years, China is going to look like the old country. Florida, right there. It's like 1 p.m. and time for the early bird dinner special. Friends, foes, fiends. Just going back to government shutdown fears, why is it that Ted Cruz and some of his colleagues thought they could take on and win against President Obama on a debate about government shutdown? Because clearly the Republicans folded. Here's something I think no one else has pointed out. What was in the headlines just before the government shutdown brinksmanship? It was Syria and the argument about whether to send missiles into Syria. And President Putin got involved in that, right? And now we're doing some deal with President Putin. I think what happened was the Republicans looked at President Obama at that moment and said, this guy is a bad chess player because he lost to Putin and he's weak, so we can take him on. Well, President Obama wasn't going to lose a chess match on his own turf when he controls the White House and the Senate. By the way, what is Putin auditioning for? I happened to be at a meeting and I had an opportunity to chat and I'm not name dropping like he's my friend, he's not my friend, but I had the opportunity to chat for a few moments with Tony Blair, former British Prime Minister. I said, Prime Minister, I feel when I see Vladimir Putin that he's auditioning for the role as the next villain in a James Bond movie. And Tony Blair said, yeah, you can almost see him petting the pussycat. Yeah, there he is, right. Okay. Let me summarize my view of the economy, all right, before I talk about education for a few minutes. The economy is not strong. Thank God it's strong here and through the I-35 corridor. But throughout the country, it's kind of tepid. Consumers are a little bit concerned again. We are growing just fast enough to stay above stall speed. We're not getting any hope from abroad because Europe is still pretty much in a recession. China has slowed down. The rest of the world's looking pretty slow too. So we've got just enough impetus to keep going. My bet is that inflation stays low. If inflation stays low, that means interest rates stay low. If interest rates stay low, that means financing costs are low for business. If I'm wrong about inflation, and I easily could be, then all bets are off and Janet Yellen's going to slam on the brakes at the Federal Reserve Board and we're going to tumble into a terrible recession because this economy can't afford high interest rates and high inflation. Okay, so that's my general view is we're just making it through and more Americans ought to move to parts of the country that believe in growth. You know, Walter Wriston, who was a chairman of Citibank, famously said something to the effect that money goes where it's wanted and stays where it's well treated. And the same thing with labor. You know, and Oklahoma is a state that wants to grow, and so many other states in this union apparently are trying to repel business. So I congratulate you for that. But what is the most important long-term economic issue? It is education. It is education, and that's why Rhonda's earlier question to the panel was so important. We are in a global race for IQ points. Whatever city, whatever company, whatever state, whatever country harnesses intelligence prospers most in the 21st century. During the 1990s, during Bill Clinton's years, the U.S. economy created 20 million net new jobs, but we lost jobs. stevedores, timber, farmers, sewers, typesetters gained jobs. Engineer, medical science, architects, legal assistants, financial services. We've got counties in this country with a high school dropout rate of 40–50%. If you don't have a high school education in this globalized economy, you are competing with the last peasant in Mongolia who yoked a yak to a plow. You're probably competing against the yak, you know, and you're going to lose. And I'm worried about our education system. Many of you will relate to this. When I was a kid, we were told we're going to learn metric. We're going to learn metric. We're going to go metric, learn metric. So we have a metric. And then I asked people, who learned metric? And then I figured out the other day who really learned it well. Get this. Drug dealers. Do you know what a kilo bag looks like? You're laughing. Do you know? Huh? I don't know what a kilo bag. Why do they know and why? Because they know they're involved in international commerce and a globalized trading economy. Do our children know that? Do our children know that? You know, we've got to create better tools for our kids. We've got to let them know. If I were a kindergarten or first grade teacher, in addition to the ABCs, you know, I'd have some equation up there that basically shows a diploma equals whatever they like in life. I don't care whether it's Nike shoes or a new iPad or a new skateboard. You ain't going to get that standard of living unless you get that diploma. And let's also be honest when we talk about college costs, and I'll save some time for Q&A. I mean, kids need to understand that certain academic degrees, certain kinds of jobs pay more than others. It shouldn't be a dirty secret. In this country today, we have more, now think about this. In the oil and gas industry, where you need steel pipes and so on, we have more theater choreographers trained than pipe fitters. So we could put on excuse the expression, a kick-ass production of Oklahoma, but when you need to hire people to actually build pipes to send to Oklahoma, we got a tougher problem with that. Okay, I've been, for the last few years, it's sort of left the national discussion. But remember all that talk about peak oil Peak oil, people used to look just until about 2 years ago, used to look at the planet and say, oh, it's empty, there's not enough oil, not enough gas, can't find enough, we can't grow enough food. I'm not worried about peak oil, I'm worried about peak people. If we develop the critical thinking skills, we can develop the resources. Look at what's been done with natural gas and fracking and horizontal drilling. The Billy Joel cover. Remember he had that song Allentown, right? And they're closing all the factories down. Bruce Springsteen had a song called Youngstown, Ohio, similar theme. Do you know they're building a new steel plant in Youngstown, Ohio? Why? Because for horizontal drilling and for fracking, you need miles and miles of steel pipe. So there is the opportunity as long as we develop. And how did we? It was a matter of the critical thinking skills and the engineering and the ingenuity. Now, I've spent a lot of time in my life writing and lecturing about education. And as Peter had mentioned, I'm getting directly involved now. I've developed a new way to show numbers to little children for 4 to 8-year-olds. This math arrow on the right, I'll just tell you a little bit about it. It goes from around 0 to 100, and it zigzags by 5s. Better than a number line, because what's amazing about setting up numbers like this, every number directly across adds to 100. So when you show kids this chart, and then you play games based on it, and our little software company Sproglit has apps. Actually, they were mentioned in The Economist magazine last week. Kids can pick up patterns on how to count by 2s and 5s and 10s and add and subtract up to 100. So it's free to download a poster, a free parent and teacher guide. I encourage you to do that. If you got kids or grandkids, go to Sproglit.com. I'm not telling you to buy anything. If you want to buy an app, fine. But I'm telling you, show this to little kids. We've got it working in Harlem, and in the Bronx in New York, and in San Diego, and in Utah. A study was done at BYU that showed it raised test scores after a week of play. Again, I apologize for making it sound like I'm selling you something. I want you to just download a free poster and show it to your kids or grandkids and make sense, and take a look at it, because I think you'll find it very interesting. And what I'm trying to do is understand how we can create new tools to give to our children. Because remember, Winston Churchill famously said to FDR and the American people during World War II, give us the tools and we will finish the job. Well, we got to give our kids the tools to do the job. God shed his grace on thee, but God did not grant our children the world's highest standard of living. They're going to have to work for it, and we're going to have to give them the tools to do it. Many of us are able to say that we're comfortable, and we can always depend on our kids if we need them, but we don't just depend on our kids. We depend on the kids of neighbors and on the children of people we will never, ever meet. That's who ultimately we depend on. And so we've got to be working in our communities, in education, devise new programs, support teachers, volunteer in classrooms. Because if we don't, then all of us and our children and grandchildren will be paying a very, very heavy price. Now, I know, I don't mean to end things on a depressing note, so let me tell you some sources of optimism. Even though our economy is tough, even though our education system may not be up to the task yet, look, all human knowledge is now free. Energy costs, I think, may plummet. I know it may pinch some of you. I'm sorry, but if you ask me, is oil more likely to go to $150 a barrel or $50 a barrel? I think it's more likely to go to $50 a barrel. Again, I'm sorry if it makes anybody uncomfortable in this room. U.S. manufacturing can win again. And then, of course, we have these other revolutions that I don't understand yet. 3D printing of regenerative tissue. You need a tissue transplant, and you'll be able to, grow a lung or at least a skin graft. And this slide there, the picture of Snoopy, just reminds me of something that Charles Schultz, who invented Snoopy, and Charlie Brown had said once. He said, if you're ever worried that the world is going to end today, just remember, in Australia, it's already tomorrow. So let me close this way. I'm a big fan of old films, which is why I enjoyed going through the Western display here. And if you haven't done that, you should. There was a Orson Welles movie called The Third Man. Some of you may remember seeing it. I watched it recently. It takes place in Austria, Vienna, after World War II. Nobody knew what would happen to Austria after World War II. There was kidnappings and chaos, assassinations. The Orson Welles character says this. He says, in Italy, under the Borgias, there was warfare, murder, bloodshed, terror. But they produced Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, the Renaissance. He says, Switzerland, 500 years of peace and quiet. What did they come up with? The cuckoo clock. My point is, in this maelstrom, in this perfect storm, made up of floods, made up of hurricanes, made up of tragic tornadoes, even in this community, made up of the bitterest political infighting, the most frightening financial meltdowns, this now, right here, is the opportunity for prosperity. This right here now is the opportunity for innovation. This is our chance to make a better life for our children, our neighbors, our community, and this great country. So I thank you so much for inviting me here today. I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. Thank you.
I have a feeling that you can ask a question about anything you want, and Todd will be able to handle it. So let's see you raise your hands. We've got microphones walking around. We have a couple of minutes. He's very nice to people who ask questions, too. Bob.
Step off of all these asset purchases they made.
Yeah, Bob asks a terrific question. How does the Fed back off of all the asset purchases? The word tapering has been used. As we all have read, the Fed buys about $85 billion worth of bonds every month. There's a long distance between 0 and 85. And frankly, I don't understand why Bernanke hadn't begun that tapering. I think it's very, because there's so much room between 85 and 0, I don't really think the markets would have been shocked or damaged terribly if he said, well, 71 today. And I think the Fed ultimately is going to have to make that move. And maybe we had a little false start in the spring, and the market hiccuped a bit. But I think markets tend not to do that twice. In other words, by having that false start and rumors that the Fed was going to begin tapering in May, it pushed up interest rates a bit. And I think a lot of the panic may have gotten out of the system. So I hope Janet Yellen begins, her term by saying not 85, but something significantly less than 85 in her first month.
Okay. Education is very important in high school and young kids. I always hear that it's important to spend more money on education, but there are some countries that they don't spend as much as we do, but are seemingly more educated. What's the missing piece there, other than just throwing money?
Yeah, I mean, money is too simple an explanation. Because if you look at the trajectory of U.S. education spending, it's been a pretty steady trajectory for years and years and years. And now we've gotten some benefits from it. I mean, Bob had mentioned earlier that high school dropout rates have improved, graduation rates have improved across all ethnic groups. So, I certainly don't want to say all the money's been wasted. But, look, I'm not sure how the Oklahoma City school system works, but here's a proposition that I would make. If you find a 7th grade algebra teacher who can get her kids motivated, get them interested, leads to higher test scores, and if she's only been teaching for 4 years, why wouldn't you pay her more than the gym teacher that's been there 20 years? If you can find an algebra teacher who can get kids motivated and get good results, you need to exalt her or him. And so I think, money can be reallocated. Secondly, when you look at the burden of the administrative burden on schools, and this also goes for universities, when you look at how much of the additional spending is going for supervisors and vice presidents and provosts and all that sort of thing, as opposed to actually in the classrooms, the money in the classrooms aren't, those numbers aren't great. One other point, I don't think the answer to these questions is as simple as a computer in every classroom or a computer in every kid's hand. Because that only begs the question, well, what's on the computer, right? And how are you going to be using it? So I fear that a lot of schools over the last 15, 20 years have spent enormous sums buying computers without actually figuring out how they can use them in the most effective way. So, those are a couple thoughts. Some school districts have now done not just merit pay, but pay based on, the discipline that the teacher is, what the teacher is trained in. And I think that's very, very important.
Number one, great presentation. I promise I'm going to buy a book. Thank you for being here. What occupies most of my worry time is a great question, and mine personally is will China ever call their note?
Good question. Well, in other words, China is one of the largest buyers of Treasury debt. And so there's this fear. At some point, China might say, well, we're in a dispute with you. We're going to dump everything on the market, and that'll destroy the U.S. dollar and so on and so forth. There was a similar fear in the 1980s and 90s about Japan, because Japan and the UK has frequently been the biggest holder, and then Japan, and then China, and they kind of jockey for position. But there was fear about Japan. Remember in the 1980s, Japan was taking over the world. Actually, I remember there was a Sean Connery movie based on a Michael Crichton novel. What was it called? Was it Rising Sun? Was that it? Yeah, Rising Sun. There was a real kind of, not paranoia, but there were all these headlines. They took over Rockefeller Center, they took over the Pebble Beach Golf Course, most of the property in Hawaii, and then it turned out they had a reverse Midas touch. Whatever the Japanese bought, it fell apart. But during that time, there was this fear that they were trying to drive our major manufacturers out of business, and they would hold our notes and then sell them. It didn't happen. Will China? Well, first of all, I have a much more respect and regard for the Japanese government and for their devotion to principles of human rights and freedom than I do for the Chinese government. I don't have a high regard for the Communist Party in Beijing. But I do think it's against their interest to dump our bonds. First of all, it's their biggest asset. So if they dump our bonds and lead to a crash in the value of U.S. Treasuries, they're going to find that their biggest asset is worth a lot less. Secondly, when China goes into the market to bid for our bonds, they're not on drugs, they're not stupid. So in other words, if the prevailing bid, let's say for a treasury, is 2.70, that's a 10-year treasury, China doesn't come in and say, well, we'll lend you the money for 2%, not 2.7. No, China and its bidders, traders, they come in and they say, all right, it's at 2.7. We really want them. We'll do 2.6999999. So I therefore think if China were absent from the market, it wouldn't quite be as shocking. And I think mostly it's against their interest. China has tremendous vulnerabilities as well. On the other hand, from a political point of view, I am worried about our long-term relations and China's ambitions in the world. As the U.S. Navy is cut back, and you look at China feeling that it owns the South China Sea and basically owns that hemisphere, or at least that sliver of the hemisphere, and you know that it's got terrible tensions with Vietnam and with Japan, I kind of worry what an ambitious China might be willing to say it's in charge of. I was in Okinawa a couple years ago, which is a Japanese island, but it's closer to China than Japan. I don't know. It wouldn't surprise me if some years to come, China says, you know what, this really should be ours, and just moves in. So, I do have concern. I guess it's not on the top of my list of concerns as it may be for you.
I think we're going to have to cut off questions. Please join me in thanking Todd for his remarks and being with us today.
Thank you very much.
We're going to wrap up. Again, I'd like to thank Arvest for their sponsorship. I'll remind you of 3 dates that are coming up. Chamber's annual meeting on December 12th, State of Airspace December 16th, and Legislative Breakfast on January 13th. Roads are getting slippery, I understand it, so be careful. And as chairman of the chamber, I am allowed to give you all the rest of the day off. So that is if you're a member. So take the day off, have a great weekend, and show up on Monday. Thank you. We're adjourned.